Tip number 1. Don't overthink the drafting process. This is probably the thing I struggled with the most until I finally accepted it. Truth is, we have an instinct to write and write well from the beginning, but that instinct is kind of mistaken, because you don't want to sit there for several hours crafting the perfect paragraph that you will ultimately end up deleting. That's another bad thing about wasting too much time during the drafting phase, writing the perfect sentences. You're not going to want to delete them later, even though you probably should in some cases. I think we're taught to think of drafting up a novel kind of like writing this perfect piece of work that just needs to get typos removed or something. And movies definitely sell you on that idea, with the writer sitting down and pumping out hundreds of pages that then never get edited. In reality, drafting is no different from sketching. Your draft should not represent the bulk of your working process. The draft is something you write hastily to get a feel of the story, the characters, and where it's going, and so on. And when you reread it, it will be painful. It will suck. But that's good, because then you'll want to delete things and improve them rather than being overprotective of them. You don't want to look at a chapter that you know is unnecessary deep down, but try to come up with reasons to keep it because you spent hundreds of hours painstakingly writing it. This is not to say that you can't be inspired, or that you can't come up with the perfect sentence the first time around. But you should do that if it comes naturally. You shouldn't just sit there for hours on end trying to force it, trying to write the best description of a hilltop or something. That's not good for you. Just write the draft, and then you'll fix it. Tip number 2. Start with short stories. This was advice that I was given at the start, but which I then decided to ignore. You see, I grew up reading epic fantasy, and my dream was always to be an epic fantasy writer. I wanted to write these series that consisted of 10 1,000-page tomes. But writing something like that can be the work of a lifetime. It's not really something you should undertake if your main desire is to seek improvement. The plain truth of it is, if you're starting out, writing short stories is way better. It will give you an idea of just how much you can put into 5,000 or 10,000 words, which is quite a bit. Honestly, there are 300, 400-page novels out there that have less things going on than a lot of excellent short stories. Working with fewer words forces you to condense the essentials into something amazing, and also saves you a lot of time. You might work on a novel for a year or years and not be done. A short story you can churn out in a day if you really want to, but you could definitely spend a month perfecting it. Then, the next time you tell someone you like writing and they ask to read something you've written, you can actually give them something tangible and good instead of telling them to wait a few years until you're done with your novel. More importantly, it's encouraging to look at something you've written and think, hey, this is done. I wrote it. I can show this to other people. They can critique it. I can fix it myself and see if I can make it better. Even if you just write one short story a month, that's going to take you through the process of drafting and finalizing a story 12 times in a single year. No doubt between January and December you'll see a marked improvement. And if you wrote a short story and realized it's bad, that's okay. You spent only a fraction of the time writing something bad, whereas you could still be writing that bad thing if it happened to be a full-fledged novel, without realizing that you'll want to discard it later down the line. For the beginner, short stories are economical and a really good way to practice. Tip number 3. Spend more time in your head. The best feeling you can have is sitting down to write knowing exactly what you want to do. You're bursting at the seams with the scene and you've played it in your head over and over, and all you have to do now is write it down. Obviously, most books will tell you the opposite. They say, just sit down and write. I mean, that's kind of true if you know what you're supposed to do and you're just avoiding it, but I don't think it's a good idea to force something you know in your gut isn't right and isn't working. Instead of sitting there staring at the screen, go to bed. Close your eyes. Listen to something that would inspire the scenes you plan to write and play them in your head repeatedly. Think about the way you would write what you're seeing. Then get up and go actually do it. Tip number 4. Let go of your filter. Don't get rid of something you like just because you're afraid other people won't like it. Don't worry, if you ever make it and become a real writer, they'll probably censor your work and change it by force anyway. So why should you do this when you have complete freedom and when you're really just writing for yourself? Even if something feels cringe or weird or gratuitously horrific, I say do it. You might not know it yet, but your fate might be to appeal to a niche you might not even know exists at the moment, or that doesn't exist before you create it. Unironically, just be yourself. Don't try and turn your work into the sort of slop that's churned out like it's written by AI. You want to be weird. You want to stand out. You want to be unique. Tip number 5. Distance yourself. This kind of goes together with my 4th piece of advice, though in the opposite direction. You should definitely explore weird stuff and make what you write your own. But what you shouldn't do is write something in which the character is a poorly disguised version of yourself. The worst part is, a lot of the people who do this, I don't think are even aware of it. They just project themselves onto their main character unthinkingly. And it's not that there's something inherently wrong about writing a story you're living yourself, but it's going to blind you to a lot of issues which you don't notice because you have a strong bias. Of course, if you're overweight, for example, you might be sensitive to what it feels like to be overweight. And of course, an interesting character could be overweight and self-conscious about it. But don't fall into the trap of consistently focusing on that one thing when it clearly shouldn't matter to the character all that much. Just because a character is overweight doesn't mean every interaction will be defined by that, or that it's the only thing on their mind. What that says to me instead is that the author is overweight, and they're clearly obsessed with it to an unhealthy degree. And it's not about being overweight specifically, it's all manner of complexes a person might have. Leave those at the door. If they inspire you with regards to some characters, that's fine. But don't turn your own complex into your character's main personality. In fact, I think the best advice is to write characters who are people you don't really like the idea of. Because if you're going in not liking them, you won't be tempted to think that what you've written is good just because it speaks about something you care about. You'll be more likely to see it for what it is and to focus on what matters.